afternoon and welcome to First Tuesday. We are thrilled you've decided to join us today. Before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping items to mention. First of all participants have been muted and your video turned off. Number two, the event is being recorded and will be made available later this week on our website. And finally, there will be time at the end of the discussion to ask questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please enter it in the Q&A function below. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. And now I'll pass it over to the Dean of the Carlson School of Management, Dean Sri Zahir.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sri Zahir, Dean of the Carlson School of Management, and I'd like to welcome you to First Tuesday. Today is our first event in 2023, and I couldn't be more excited to have Professor Mark Bergen join us today. But before I get to Mark, I want to recognize First Tuesday's long-standing corporate and media partners, Wells Fargo and Twin Cities Business. And a special thank you to all of our alumni joining us from all around the world today. I know many of you probably took classes with Mark. Okay, let me tell you now about Professor Mark Bergen. I promise to keep it brief. There's no shortage of things to say about him. Mark is the James D. Watkins Chair in Marketing at the Carlson School. He's been teaching here for over 20 years, and he reminded me just now that he actually did his doctorate right here, and he met his wife while working at the Earl Brown Center, where he was washing dishes to pay for graduate school. Anyway, Mark's research focuses on pricing and on channels of distribution, where he studied issues such as pricing as a strategic capability, price wars, pricing as truces, pass-through, branded variants, dual distribution, gray markets, co-op advertising, and quick response. Mark, I didn't see pricing and inflation there. I'm really interested in that. Anyway, his work has been published in some of the top journals in the country, including the Journal of Marketing Research, as well as Harvard Business Review and the Sloan Management Review. And at the Carlson School, he's taught undergraduates, MBAs, executive education, and PhD courses on pricing strategy and marketing management, earning him numerous awards for teaching excellence at the Carlson School, as well as recognition as an outstanding faculty member. Additionally, he serves as a consultant with companies in the medical, service, food, retail, and industrial markets. Mark, as I mentioned, probably I didn't, holds a BS from a school to the east of us that has a badger as its mascot, and a PhD in economics from the University of Minnesota, but I can tell you that he bleeds maroon and gold. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mark Bergen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sri. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to share screen to get the conversation started. And Sri, if we get time at the end, we can talk about the most recent HBR.org article on 3 lessons from hyperinflations and helping companies manage during inflation. But just sharing my family at the centennial, parents and wife and brother and children, and his children as well. But what I'll do is start the slideshow from the beginning and welcome you all into the house of pricing. So that's the first way to start as we begin. Bring your brightest opportunities, your biggest challenges, all your questions. We're together for an hour, and I look forward to our sharing our thoughts in pricing. Just before we begin on today's topic, I do want to make sure you're aware how strong Minnesota is in pricing. I like to describe Minnesota as a Camelot for pricing. Did you know that over the last 20 years, 5 Nobel laureates in economics were given the Nobel Prize and did their path-breaking work or were highly connected to the University of Minnesota? Ed Prescott, who just passed away, Tom Sargent, Chris Sims, Elio Hurwicz, and Lars Peter Hansen, who was a graduate student here. Back as Sri said, when I was washing dishes, I took classes from these 4 faculty in younger days as that went. Now, why does that matter to price? It turns out that microeconomics is known as price theory in the economic field. And Minnesota is famous for what they call the micro foundations of macroeconomics. suggesting that the role of price theory has to play through all of economics as we know it. Did you know that the first book that was ever written in pricing that I can find in business schools was by Don Harper in our marketing and logistics management department? I have a copy here at home. I keep a precious copy there. I have a copy up on your screen. And he talked about how companies actually went about doing the work of pricing and was one of the first to describe it as we tried to make pricing a more scientific discipline. It is a place that has defining research. I'm just lucky enough to talk about it, but folks like George John, Akshay Rao, Joe Redden, they're fantastic in the field. We cover a lot of topics that Shri talked about. We have a semester-long course devoted entirely to pricing. I've looked around globally. It's the longest course that I can find out there, and the students who take it from me say it feels even longer. We have custom executive education arrangements and just a community of talented students, alumni, organizations. This is the place to be if you want to be in pricing. So today, what I want to talk to you about is what I believe is one of the biggest things happening in pricing currently. And I'm going to use a quote from Jim Guzka, who's currently at the Center for Advanced Study for Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, but is the chief data scientist at Deloitte. And this is what he says: we're in a new era of supercharged price discrimination, made possible by two major scientific and technological trends. First, AI algorithms, often trained on highly detailed behavioral data that enable organizations to infer what people are willing to pay with unprecedented precision. And second, recent developments in behavioral science, often invoked with the tagline nudge, that provide organizations with greater ability to influence their customers' behavior. So this is at the center of what all companies are trying to get better at, where technology and behavioral science fit to kind of help us do pricing better. You should know Minnesota sits at the epicenter of both of these areas. In terms of information decision sciences, in terms of the AI algorithms, Minnesota has for over 40 years been the center of information decision sciences. It was the birthplace of the management and information systems. It's been in the top 3 nationally and internationally ever since I've been at Carlson School. I've got just a few of the faculty creating knowledge down there at the bottom, but you should know that if you're interested in this way of pricing, Minnesota is the place to be. And in terms of behavioral science, we have some of the defining behavioral scientists in the field. Akshay Rao, I would argue, is the preeminent behavioral pricing expert globally right now. Kathleen Voss is internationally renowned for her understanding of behavioral decision theory and how psychology affects pricing. And Vladis Griskevicius to the left is also one of the foremost experts in thinking about pricing. He was just presenting in a PhD seminar talking about the role of inflation and uncertainty and how pricing would work. So again, in marketing, you're at the epicenter of behavioral science. So if you want to combine those two, technology and behavioral science, you want to supercharge your ability to price discriminate, this is the place to be. More than ever, companies are able to tailor their prices across people, places, and time. The terms that are used in this in the field are personalized pricing, smart pricing, dynamic pricing. And my favorite phrase to say what companies can do with pricing today is get the right price to the right person in the right place at the right time. There's an incredible amount of specificity, an incredible amount of ability to discriminate across people, places, and time. So I'll pause there for a moment with the celebration of what Minnesota does well and kind of this big area of pricing that's growing and is all around us today. And I'll pause because today's talk isn't going to be about that. If you want to follow up with it, we can follow up later in discussion in the meeting. Mine's going to be around a word that we just passed through that I want you to think about for a moment, which is price discrimination is seen as a good thing because it lets you get the right price to the right person at the right place in the right time. But when you hear the word discrimination, what first comes to mind? So I'll actually to pause for a minute And I don't know, think of a piece of paper, or if you're watching with a friend, or if you know somebody in the chat. When I say the word discrimination, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Profits, ability to get the right price at the right moment when you're walking by the store. And I'll pause for a minute. I'll keep talking, I promise, but I want you to start with this idea of what discrimination means to us in our lives normally. I never know what's the appropriate amount of time to be quiet on Zoom. I always had a rule of count to 17. But with the pause, I want you to start our discussion today then from this idea. And Meenakshi Rangalingam, who is an RA who helped us through a lot of the work we'll talk about today, always said, be aware and beware of when price discrimination becomes social discrimination. So one of the things that happens when we're using all this heavy, high-powered machinery in pricing is we can set a lot of prices that actually do lead into social discrimination. So for example, you could price in a way that blocks essential needs. On the left, you've got coronavirus pricing, where face masks were just priced out of bounds, where even first responders couldn't get them in prices. And in the right, of course, we know in the drug pricing world, in a non-pandemic world, prices for drugs that might be key for people with chronic ailments can often be priced in a very high and excessive way. You could think of it on the bottom right about discrimination across social groups. There's a famous thing called the pink tax, that women pay more for men than men for almost everything, even though wages for women are often lower than men in these settings. And it's all out of the AI and algorithms and analyses. It's profitable, but it does discriminate in a way that reinforces social discrimination. The Geico example, sorry, I moved the screen too quickly. The Geico example, where insurance company was charging blue-collar workers much more for insurance than white-collar workers, because that's what the data said. But again, it was discriminating against people based on income and other things. And then the ability for companies to take advantage of customers using this AI and big data and all of these new ways of pricing can be quite extreme, from how Uber has approached using behavioral economics and all of the AI to reduce what they pay their drivers, to Amazon using the same thing to get small entrepreneurial companies and move into their markets more quickly and successfully than they can. So at the same time that this is an amazing technology that can do so much good, there's also a chance for this technology to do a great deal of harm. Meenakshi used to say, again, when price discrimination becomes social discrimination, beware. And this is what I want to talk to you about today. That today's overlapping crises and changing attitudes highlight a truth that's often been hidden in plain sight. Such supercharged pricing strategies can cause real harm to individuals, organizations, and societies. And think about the overlapping crises we've had in just the last 3 years: COVID, racial justice, war in Ukraine, inflation, as well as this growing use of AI, big data, and analytics and behavioral science to set prices to us individually and over time. All right, so that's my start, kind of leads into a set of things that happened in Minnesota during COVID. And I just wanted to walk you through a story that's around the paper that you see at the bottom that was published in hbr.org in 2021. So while we were working on pricing in this particular area, we were asked by Carlson Executive Education to write something to help people during COVID. And so we thought about it, and we put together a piece that we called the N95 Mask for Pricing to try to help people price more socially, beneficially as a way to help. To do this, we presented to Minnesota MBA students and alumni in a brown bag virtually from the basement offices here in Hopkins of the Minnesota Pricing Studios in my house. Then they wrote a piece in executive education in their leadership in the age of disruption. It was picked up by USC, because one of my co-authors, Shantanu Dutta, is there. So we did something they call a Tommy Talk, very Hollywood. And we ended up doing research for the Journal of Marketing and other places on how to think about how to avoid social infractions, insincerities, and abuses in pricing, the social structure of market exchange. And it all ended up being an HBR paper you can take a look at the end on how AI can help companies set prices more ethically. So how did this happen and where did this come from in this journey? I first just want to thank Minnesota for making this journey possible with all the support across all the groups. What we did is we looked, if you were going to get help during COVID in pricing, we thought perhaps we should look at bioethics, where medicine was bringing science, bringing society into their decision-making. And this article's title captured our imagination, that compassion and kindness amid coronavirus, Hippocratic Oath was a guiding light. So what we did was we started with the way bioethics looked at the world, and it had three areas: social impact, do good or do no harm. That's both the golden rule, but also we learned Confucian rules, which was just the other way: do not do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. It also focused on justice, so work by people like Rawls or Amartya Sen on helping people who are vulnerable, limiting discrimination, being more fair. And it also talked a lot about empowerment, so that people could make better decisions in healthcare rather than be misused. So the idea of transparency, dignity, and explainability, very Kantian in its view, as if people should be treated as an end themselves rather than a mean to others' ends. And we used that, we changed it around slightly. So we took justice, empowerment, and social impact, and we tried to make it into an N95 mask. And we thought of it as filters, that if during this really difficult time where you had to price and do things, you just checked quickly, can these prices block an essential need? That's a filter. Can your pricing harm a vulnerable group? That's a filter. Can these prices take advantage of customers? That's a filter. And those filters together, we called the N95 mask for pricing. We said if companies use that during difficult times, they were much less likely to create harm and much more likely to be able to be socially beneficial. It turned out when they finally published the paper, the title N95 mask for pricing, they thought would confuse people, and they thought they'd think the article was on N95 mask pricing and when to raise it and when to lower it. So they ended up just saying, let's call it 3 questions. So these are what I'd like to have you think about today as we are in this part of the talk. When you're in these kinds of crises, when social things matter, when society's in turmoil, think about what you're selling. And can your prices actually block access to something essential for, food for families, education for children? Step back and think, who are you selling to? Can these prices harm vulnerable groups, women or the working class or other areas? And then think about how you're selling. Can these prices take advantage of your customers? And this is kind of our soapbox then, to think about pricing, even in this world of AI and algorithms and behavioral science, to make sure that you're pricing in a way that's safe for your customers, safe for your organization, safe for your community, safe for your society. So what we did in the paper is we created examples both during the pandemic. So when you read the paper, it'll be a little more pandemic heavy given the title. And that would go from toilet paper and hand sanitizer and mask pricing to things that were also not during COVID. So for example, drug pricing in this setting. To me, you could think of luxuries versus necessities. And what was interesting was things that used to be luxuries became necessities in COVID. So be thinking about luxuries you can probably use, you'll probably be safe, but if it's a necessity, make sure you're not blocking that essential need for people who need them. The second we focused on was harming vulnerable groups. Again, the pink tax and information around insurance were where we started in the non-pandemic side, but we talked a lot about how the poor and the vulnerable were often the ones who lost most during the pandemic. And I'd remind you to be careful to distinguish between price discrimination and social discrimination. The line is very easy to blur and easy to cross. The third one was companies taking advantage of customers. During COVID, many companies didn't have cancellation policies, refund policies. I remember even Disney was late to tell people that to cancel different kinds of plans they had that they couldn't use during COVID. And as we mentioned before, companies like Uber and Amazon often take advantage of their customers because of the power and information they've got available. So they need to ask and answer these questions as they go on. So we did kind of examples in the paper. And from there, we, of course, said, well, how would you use this? And the idea was, if you asked all three of those questions and the answer was no, you could probably go ahead with your pricing. You weren't blocking an essential need. You weren't harming a vulnerable population that you knew of. You weren't taking advantage. It was probably more safe for your customers, company, and society. But if your answer was yes, then the question was, what should I do? And we really had three areas to help people tactically be able to do pricing. The first was be creative. The second was be willing to compromise between profitability and survival against these societal issues and discrimination. And then the third was to communicate with all stakeholders involved. And I'll share a couple of those examples that I found particularly effective during COVID. One was a company in Norway. My grandfather came off the boat from Bergen, Norway, so strong Norwegian ties. And the company Many was having trouble selling hand sanitizer because if it priced it normally, people would buy it in bulk and they would hoard it. And if they priced it high, then poor, lower income families weren't able to get hand sanitizer. So what they did was they priced in the following way. I thought it was really creative. First bottle of hand sanitizer, low price. Second bottle of hand sanitizer, $100 in US dollars. So basically you could buy one, but if you wanted to hoard, you'd have to price higher. And so they were able to accomplish both as they brought it in. One of my favorite ideas of creativity, not during the pandemic, was Hyundai, who during the last Great Recession, when the auto industry lost tremendous amounts of money and companies slashed prices on cars, Hyundai went to their customers and learned that the problem wasn't the price of cars. The problem was people were afraid of losing their jobs. So they kept their price normal and created a Hyundai Assurance Job Loss Protection Program. And if you lost your job, you could sell the car back for its original price and you'd be fine. It worked wonderfully. They were the only company not to lose money during the Great Recession here. And what happened was, I believe only about 900 cars were ever returned, all of which were sold at high resale prices because they were in good condition and relatively new. And all that took was understanding creatively what were the issues, the societal issues, what were the profitability issues, and how to work well together. The being willing to compromise and communicate probably is best for me seen by Uber, who of course with surge pricing often made people very angry during very bad weather in moments or times when they were most vulnerable. The prices would get beyond what people could pay. Ended up being brought in front of many state governments and federal governments and international governments to talk about it. And what they did is they compromised. They worked to cap their prices during emergencies and disasters to a certain level. And they would donate any additional monies they made to places like the American Red Cross during those times. But that still allowed them to keep using surge pricing in normal times. And they communicated that widely across their markets. And as the CEO mentioned, this policy intends to strike the careful balance between the goal of transportation availability with communication expectations of affordability during disasters. So kind of a natural route by which to think about how to handle pricing in these places. In many ways, that's kind of where we thought in the paper we would be as we were. But what we really wanted to do was move one level higher. I think from the tactical, we wanted to move to the strategic, to the to the more societal. And so this is really where I want to spend the rest of my time when I'm up in front of the stage in the talk, with how can AI help companies actually bring these societal issues into their pricing more effectively and therefore be able to price more ethically. And I challenge you as at your company to think about refining pricing capabilities in ways that keep ethical considerations front and center, exercising creativity and judicious compromise, and communicating with forthrightness and transparency can enable your organizations to pursue the profit motive in ways that help rather than harm the populations they depend on and serve. So this is actually where I'm working in pricing right now. We kind of title our current work in pricing, AI Pricing and Justice. And this is with Mark Zabracki out at Ivy at Western University in Canada, and Shantanu Dutta out at Marshall School of Business at USC. And the key thing I want you to think about as you go back at your company and say, how could I put these ethical considerations front and center, is to realize that actually underneath all of these examples, all the power of AI and big data and analytics, and all of the fear we have about all the social discrimination and the harm that can cause, are actually two different approaches to justice. So sitting underneath this machinery and these ways prices flow are two different ways to think about what being just is all about. And they're both impacted by AI. Let me turn to take each one in turn. The first one is the one we're most familiar with. It's what we teach in business schools. In the world of pricing, it's at the front and center of what we do. And it's really this idea that prices allow people to make better choices. They create economic efficiency. They create Pareto efficiency in markets. And essentially this idea that the price system is a way to help people make decisions that are more just and allocate things more effectively in a society. I learned it as the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics taught by Leo Hurwicz. And it was the idea that competitive equilibria, market prices were Pareto efficient, assuming that there was information, no monopolies, no externalities and transactions costs. You may know it more in the language of Adam Smith, kind of the invisible hand, but it's really this faith in the power of markets. And just so you know, I'm a huge fan. I'm a minion. I'm from that school of thought. There's no doubt to me that that's some of the key parts of justice that the price system brings to us. And what I can say is in the pricing field, we built an impressive set of technical tools, analyses, processes, and capabilities to do this, from understanding your costs to demand and elasticity, heavy growing exponentially with the use of AI, big data, digital information, and analytics. And actually from the strategy side, we even at the Carlson have been at the forefront of this as pricing as a strategic capability, and pricing as a kind of using a resource-based perspective, both in the Strategic Management Journal and the Sloan Management Review, kind of arguing that these capabilities can be incredibly powerful and even be a source of sustainable competitive advantage. So I'm a big fan of pricing being the right price to the right person in the right place at the right time. And I'm a big fan in this way of efficient markets, or what we call a utilitarian justice. Sorry for the jargon. That's always true at the start of research. As we get better, we'll clean that up. But here's what I'd like you to think about as well. When we talked about the word discrimination, when I mentioned the word justice, this may not be necessarily the first thing that comes to mind. It may be that you have a different view of justice that's more related to virtue, more of an Aristotelian view of justice. And think about if Aristotle described something as being just, he described it this way. All right, can you do the right thing to the right person at the right time, to the right extent, in the right manner, for the right purpose? Notice that's much more related to those three questions that we had in the HBR.org paper last year. providing access to essential needs, helping empower vulnerable people, helping empower people more generally. And it's a different set of questions. And again, I want to just juxtapose it. Not the right place to the right person in the right place, to the right person in the right place at the right time to get the most profit and efficiency in the market, but actually doing the right thing to the right person at the right time, to the right extent, in the right manner for the right purpose. What I'd argue in the world of pricing is we have far fewer tools to help us answer these questions than we do in the utilitarian view of justice. And let's just take a look at how this question might be different. Think about applying it to one of our earlier examples. So I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but Uber uses AI and analytics and behavioral science to set its surge prices, but it also uses that to set its pricing to its drivers. And for several years, it was using all the power of AI, all the power of behavioral science to find ways to get drivers to drive more for less money. And let me go back to the utilitarian view of justice. In a utilitarian view, that's exactly what business should do. So there is a wisdom, there's a justice to what Uber's doing. But in a different view of justice that has a broader social fabric, a more Aristotelian or virtue-based, it's not clear that that way of pricing actually meets the standards of being just. Is it the right thing to be trying to tease out extra money from the gig economy set of workers? Is the gig economy set of workers the place where you need to extract your profits, given that it's often some of our most vulnerable and underpaid people within the economy? Was it during COVID and other times the right time to be squeezing money from that particular set, that particular group? Should they be doing it with as much rigor and as much emphasis to try to save large amounts of money to that particular setting? And was that even the right purpose as they brought it out? So what I want you to think about is, when you think about these questions, there's a utilitarian logic and there's also a virtue-based logic. They're different logics. Both are real, both are true, both are happening. They're just two different aspects of justice that are always at play whenever you set a price. And I'm hoping by the end of today that you'll not only want to use this kind of way of pricing to set your prices to be profitable and help make markets efficient, but you'll also be open to using this way of pricing to help understand how you can bring societal issues and other definitions and frameworks of justice into your pricing processes, into the way you think about pricing decisions, into the way that you do business. This is my last academic slide, but I do want to kind of highlight that in the world of pricing, the conversation tends to shift very quickly to utilitarian views of justice. We have a robust narrative. We have a lot of information. We have a lot of analytics, and that's only growing. These other elements of justice, virtue or Aristotelian, they tend to be brought in as exceptions. They tend to be brought in as problems. They tend to be brought in as emotional. We don't have a lot of data. We don't have a lot of other things we can evaluate. And yet they're just as important. They're just as foundational. They're just as important as you think about being just as it would be to be efficient and help choice be more effective. Which means in our lives as managers, in our lives as students, in our lives as faculty, that we have to think about how we adjudicate and have a conversation between two wholly different ways to think about justice. And so we have to treat this, my colleague Mark Zabracki likes to say then, as a political problem, not conservative liberal, but around this idea of how do I have a conversation about different aspects of justice that are both happening whenever I set that price. And this is happening not just at the individual level, so for you listening today, but this is happening at the organizational level, the community level, the societal level. I had a very big kind of epiphany moment this year in class. We invited Dakota Pippins in from New York to talk about these kinds of societal issues in pricing. And he does just such a wonderful job. He started the corporate social relationships class at NYU. He was on Hormel's board. Jeff Ettinger helped bring him to the class. And he's so passionate about it. But most of the discussion was happening in the minds of the students, with Dakota trying to help them bring these kinds of ideas into their thinking, and them trying to bring the utilitarian ideas back across. And it suddenly made me realize that even though in classes we treat this as an individual level decision, actually the discussion had to be happening at the companies that people were going to be working at. It wasn't just that an individual understands it. It was, how will the chief pricing officer talk about it with the salesperson who's seeing the effect in the community, with the C-suite. And it's got to happen more broadly beyond the organization, into the communities we're part of and the societies we're part of. And so for me, my current call out and request to you is helping us think and understand about how to have this conversation between one way of justice, which is about efficiency and profit, and another aspect of justice that's about societal effect and impact, both of which are real, both of which are true, both of which are foundational, but they're difficult to have the conversation on. But I think if we can't have them, it's going to limit our ability to make headway in this particular area. So let me share with you success stories in this. I think it's possible. I worked through executive education with one company that's a medical supply company. And I was talking with them about what they did during COVID. And I was struck by how they moved between these different definitions of justice. When we were talking about their pricing processes to begin the talk, it was all about costs, profit, efficiency, very utilitarian. And that was the goal of the session, help make that even more effective. And we did. But what they said was, during COVID, they realized that their current rules of pricing would actually cause their healthcare providers, the hospitals, the medical centers, the doctors, the nurses, to not be able to practice healthcare effectively, that they would either just not be able to do it or they'd go out of business. So this company actually brought all their senior leaders together and said, how do we price now? Because our old rules of pricing are going to violate these societal issues. And this was the list of goals they told me that they recreated during COVID. Safety first for them and their customers, allowing their customers to practice healthcare second, and then financial survival third. So what did that mean? That meant there were some customers they took a loss on the things they needed to practice healthcare. They tried to make their money back on things that weren't essential to providing healthcare, but were kind of more optional luxury items, or tried to pick it up later in the relationship as they kind of looked at it. And if they had to price higher than they thought fit, they communicated exactly why, and they looked for ways to be creative. Could they share the cost and spread it over a year or two? Could they look at new ways of financing? Could they be creative in this way? And so what they did was they tried to look at both elements of justice and put them into the processes that they look at, creating new pricing rules teams that assured customers could still practice. And I would ask you to think at your companies how you bring those social things, but that invitation is coming soon. Oh, and I'm looking at time, sooner than I thought. I want to remind you that researchers are doing this all the time. I just want to call out one of my favorite applied economics researchers, who is also my TA in the pricing class, for those of you who had the chance to meet him, Elliot Charette, who worked for the Council of Economic Advisors as a staff economist just this last summer, and now is working at the Federal Reserve Bank, Sri, in Minneapolis on this. And his passion is studying vulnerable populations on vulnerable needs. For him, it's the Native American community. And what he's doing is he's connecting back to the information decision sciences world, looking for data sets to help understand food deserts, or why you get shortages on luxuries and necessities, and doing some really interesting work with companies like Data Assembly, which is a company that gets real price data at every retailer for every product, and just has a huge data set that they're willing to share with academics to work in this area. I met the head of data assembly at a Mani Subramani chaired conference of information decision sciences, where he created a session. And this is what we talked about during my session around pricing, was how to get these societal issues in. So here we are with the computer scientists, here we are with Elliot, and this is the kind of talk and way that we were thinking about it as you look and come to think about conferences and ways that we can participate together. So here's my invitation to you in my last, I believe, 5 minutes that I have in the talk. I want to invite you to join our research conversation. And you can do that in multiple ways. The first thing we're seeking is, how are your companies bringing in virtues and other elements of justice into your pricing? How do you check on keeping from blocking access to essential needs, harming vulnerable people? How are you empowering your customers? And we don't care how it is. Are you just having conversations about it? Do you have some initiatives on it? Have you put it in your pricing processes? Have you measured any outcomes? Anything you're doing in this area, we are thirsty to learn. I hang out with business anthropologists. They're the Jane Goodalls of pricing. We want to go in the field and learn where this is being done to understand what works, but also understand what's hard about it and how you work through the difficulties of navigating an adjudication between two strong and powerful ways to understand justice. The second is, can you share examples of how your existing processes, data, metrics, analyses, AI, match up with other ways these elements of justice are being addressed? So maybe you're pricing your products, but you're aware of food deserts. How and where did the food deserts come in? And how do you grapple between the two? The third, which you may not be at yet, but some companies are you actually creating metrics, analyses, data, and AI to address serving essential needs, serving vulnerable populations, empowerment? Do you have an empowerment metric on how your pricing is helping people make better decisions socially as well as profitably? I would invite you to explore opportunities to do joint research together. Some of my favorite and our most famous studies came from companies that said, we have these pricing issues, we're willing to study it with you. Our team is happy to go in the field with you and work. And as we always like to say, you're always welcome to join the exploration in the House of Pricing on pricing research, as well as pricing education. But it doesn't stop just with our team. I would urge you to think about in connecting with our research centers. I just picked two. The Institute for Research and Marketing, who's directed by Michelle Champlin-Berger, is constantly looking for understanding these behavioral aspects, these information decision sciences aspects, and these ideas of other notions of social justice. I presented this talk at the IRM. Joel Walfolk was presenting his research on using data in the IRM. We've had people from information decision sciences come in. And so it's a wonderful place. It's a center I'm aware of. But the Management of Information Systems Research Center is also a fantastic place, and it's been around for a long time. Soumya Sen is the academic director, but I picked Kevin as the outreach coordinator. They're constantly connecting research and practice, both on technology and behavioral science, because we believe they can help your companies, and also business as a force for good. And that's going to be the kind of places where you're going to meet folks like Elliot Charette and Mani Subramani and Data Assembly, people in academics and people in practice meeting together to move things forward and make the world a better place. And then I have to call out to the very people that started all our work in this area, executive education, led now by Ellen Trader. They are ready to partner with you on pricing and business, build your organizational capabilities, can give you lifelong learning in technology, in behavioral science. I work with companies all the time to help them be able to get the right price to the right people in the right place in the right time and be more profitable, but also as business as a force for good, and the importance that that brings. And that's the balance that I'd like you to think of. And in fact, I know it's a busy slide, but this is what I'd like you to end with from the talk today. Carlson is at the forefront of pricing, I believe, as a force for good. And what do I mean by good? One way I mean by good is utilitarian justice. The ability to set the right price to the right person at the right place at the right time that makes the price system work and be efficient and lets you be more profitable and lets people make better choices. That is a just way to view the world. Don't ever think that it's not an important aspect of what prices and markets are about, but it is not the only aspect of what prices and markets are about. And we've known this since the inception of work in economics. Adam Smith and the early economists were philosophers as well as economists and understood this all within the context of communities and societies. And we can also tailor prices across people, places, and time socially so that you at your company can also be doing the right thing to the right person at the right time, to the right extent, in the right manner, and for the right purpose. And Carlson, I believe, is one of the few places that can do both. Carlson's balance, kind of in like the Karate Kid, who's able to stand on one leg at the end of the movie and win the match. We can support you in technology and behavioral science, that utilitarian idea of justice, and we can support you as business as a force for good, that idea of virtue. So I leave you with a question. AI, big data, analytics, and marketing can help you do both of those. Will they? Well, that's up to you. And if you want it to be that way, we're here and ready to partner anytime. Thank you very much for the chance to talk with you here. They asked me to kind of pause here so we could leave time for questions. Don't hesitate to reach out to me at that email address here. And of course, this deck, I'm sure we'll be able to make available to anyone who wants to see it. And with that, I think I'll stop sharing screen and turn it back over to Amy and
Yes.
and everyone who's been here. Thank you for staying with me this long.
Thank you so much, Mark. We have a ton of questions that have come in, so I'm going to get started. Some are referring to a couple of the first slides that you showed. Someone's asking,
Okay.
who defines what essential need is, or can you define those terms for us, or what you looked at in terms of essential needs, please?
Yeah, that's great. And let me go back to, I'll go back to this question slide, is it's there. So for us, again, what we were trying to do was trying to get at this idea of kind of social impact and kind of this idea of where people were most vulnerable. So this is kind of our term. So we just said, think about essential needs. And actually, maybe it's better to go to the slide on essential needs. Sorry, right here. And so for us, it was very straightforward. It was, for example, food. You could think of education. You could think of healthcare. You didn't have to go very far to get to some very basic notions of essential. You could think of it in kind of hierarchy of needs. The work this struck me in my mind, which I'm kind of circling in the middle here, is Arthur Oken's work on luxuries versus necessities. And long ago, as an economist, he used to say, free markets are great for luxuries, but for necessities, we may have to price in a different way. But I don't have a formal definition of essential needs. That's actually an open, I'm going to write it down, an open research direction is simply what is essential. And I think it's a great question because what struck me was during COVID, things like hand sanitizer, that if you were normally pricing hand sanitizer, you didn't have to worry very much about whether you're essential need. During COVID, it was essential. And so suddenly society's views and communities' views and customers' views of how you priced were much more societal than they were before that. So I do believe that the definition of essential is probably also contextual, so that it depends on the situation. I would use good judgment, but I'd love if that whoever asked the question would like to come join us in the research to actually get a better definition of essential and bring that out to help companies be able to do it better. I hope that answered their question.
Yes, no, that was great. Thank you so much. How do we, as a society, ensure that companies actually do use the 3 questions in their pricing strategies?
So that's another great question. So go up to them. As from my side, my goal is to help managers and organizations be able to do this themselves. And in my experience, they want to do this. It's just that they don't have as much machine, they don't have a language, they don't have the data, they don't have the machinery. These questions haven't been as developed as they can and should be in our hopes. And so my take on it is help them be able to do it better. And it's actually what they want to do. And it's actually, I mean, for most managers and organizations, these are all things that are so foundational and human. I can't imagine anyone waking up saying, I want to violate these things. Now, that said, if companies aren't able to do this fast enough or able to do this well enough, then what do we tend to see? The first place we see people joining in is social media. And they just simply complain about these things to make sure that everyone knows that somebody blocked an essential need, somebody harmed a vulnerable group, and therefore it affects the reputation and it affects the people, the companies in those settings. So one way is vote with your feet and vote with your voice and let companies know using all the new communication tools we have. A second way is community activism, so working within communities to work with companies. And a third is to go to governments. And that's where you saw with Uber, for example. I think if I go to Uber's example here, Uber didn't do this proactively. They were brought in through regulation and other kinds of ideas, and they were brought in to kind of make that happen. So my goal is that this will help people do what they want to do with these questions. But societally, these are important issues. And if essential needs are blocked, vulnerable people are harmed, or people are being taken advantage of, governments and communities have tools and ways to be able to do that. And these would be, in my mind, good reasons for those kinds of interactions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. We have a question about high information disparity situations. So in terms of pricing. So what about high information disparity situations where consumers seldom engage in the purchasing decisions? So like home, auto, insurance for those products. How should consumers utilize these new tools to level the playing field?
It's a great point. And let me go to a couple slides. And I'm sorry if they move too fast for everybody in these settings. I'm going to go faster way to the end. And I apologize, this is the jargony slide. But this idea of high information disparity is the problem. The utilitarian view of pricing, which is data owned by companies, is really well developed. The muscles are very strong, and they're only getting stronger. So the gap between a traditional consumer or a family and an organization is only growing. So this idea then is, how can we start to build tools and ways to help individuals and families and communities and societies get access to this kind of information as you bring it in? To me, that's kind of this idea of a set of, and I'll go kind of what I think we were asking, metrics, analyses, data, AI. What can we do to use all these tools that are out there to make this happen? So think about it. There are actually shopping tools that we could try to help to make people more aware. There's education. During inflation, one of the things that worried me the most is that people lose money at the beginning of inflation the fastest, and the ones with the least information lose the most money. So the idea of helping build inflation literacy, helping out with the media to help train people where they can easily see this, having coaches and classes and online resources to help you think about this, using the AI as tools, using the AI to collect data, to create reports out there, looking for third-party groups that might be wanting to do work in the area, institutions like the Carlson School and University of Minnesota to collect data and metrics in these kinds of areas that can become part of the public discourse. I think all of those are directions we should be heading. It is a big gap, though, and the gap is growing quickly as the big data sources and these tools and things happen. So I'm all for any and all things to be working that way. And again, yeah, you think of AI and technology to help the consumers as well as to help the firms. Sorry if I rambled there. It's like a passion for me. To me, these are the kinds of initiatives and places in pricing we can be doing to help make this conversation work better and help things balance. so that organizations can do a better job, managers can do a better job, and their communities and societies can too? Great question, and right at the heart of what I think is perhaps one of our central problems today. Maybe think of it as, how can we get consumer-based, and in particular, those consumers who are least able to get information, how can we empower them with the right kind of pricing information to be able to help them to be successful?
That's great. And we've got a kind of a different take on for this question, Mark. It says, how can government agencies, the state attorney generals, the Consumer Protection Board, utilize these tools to help consumers?
Yeah, so that's another place where we could be building these kinds of capabilities. I think the key there is to try to take, for example, the data of how many people couldn't get access to an essential need, like in a food desert. Could they collect that data? Could they use AI? Could they use analyses and metrics to start to give us information on that, as well as the profitability? And I do think that government agencies and social groups and third parties may be the place that will be helping fund this kind of work, because the societal things are so real and so powerful to bring it in. I think what's important is that side of the equation needs more AI analytics. It needs more Carlson information decision sciences, Carlson marketing behavioral sciences. But it can't be only that. And I think that's the key. You have to value both definitions of justice. So when I talk to the policymakers in government, I go, please help get those societal things measured and discussed and bring them into the conversation and use your power to balance the information disparities. But don't forget the utilitarian idea of justice. You still need efficiency. You still need choice. You still need markets to function. And that's this idea, as we talked about, this idea of adjudication, or this kind of political problem. To do it right, both sides need to be at the table, and we're going to have to make trade-offs to be creative and compromise and communicate with each other. Right now, you're correct. Both sides aren't at the table. Utilitarian has a bunch of seats. The other social aspects of justice are they're at the kids' table trying to get a chance to join the other one at Thanksgiving. But as we get them to the table, it's not one side versus the other. It's both sides are true, both sides are real. How do we navigate the realities of both of our understandings of justice to be able to create the world we all want to live in?
Well, Mark, we have so many more questions that are coming in, but unfortunately, it looks like we're out of time. So I'm going to turn this back over to Shri, and we'll have to invite you back for another presentation so that we can get all the questions answered.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. That was such a thoughtful presentation, Mark. I keep thinking that, we have to think about, pricing for efficiency and good, or maybe efficiency itself is an element of good. So it's just wonderful to hear how you thought about ethical pricing and how we can set prices more ethically. And I hope the audience has gone away with a lot of ideas to mull over. And thank you to everyone who joined us today over Zoom. And I hope you can join us for our next First Tuesday event in March, where we will be back in person at the McNamara Alumni Center, and also, of course, available online. But this time to hear from Jean Crane, who's the president and CEO of Bremer Financial Corporation. So I hope to see you all in March, either in person or online. So thank you for being here.